Governments hid nuclear disasters, covered up secret wars, and ran operations that stayed buried for decades before the truth finally came out. These sound like conspiracy theories, they're actually just genuine conspiracies. Here are 10 times governments got caught lying to their own people. For years, the American public was being told the Vietnam War was going fine. The government's line was that troops were over there to keep the peace, that they were winning, that it was all under control. Then a guy named Daniel Ellsberg decided he couldn't keep his mouth shut anymore. Worked as a military analyst, which meant he had access to things the public was not supposed to see, so he sat down and photocopied a 7,000-page top-secret report that the Defense Department had put together, then handed the whole thing to the newspapers. What was inside those pages was bombshell. Turned out that 4 presidents in a row had been flat out lying about the war. Apparently the government was a lot less optimistic about the war than they made it out to be, but they kept sending young men over there anyway. It got worse. While they were publicly saying the conflict was limited to Vietnam, they'd secretly been expanding into Cambodia and Laos. When this hit the front pages, a lot of people, understandably, never quite saw the government the same way again. Back in the early 50s, Iran had a prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh, who'd actually been elected by the Iranian people. He made a decision that upset a lot of powerful people, though. He said that Iran's oil, which at the time was being run almost entirely by a British company, should belong to Iran. Western governments publicly said they wanted to sit down and work things out diplomatically, and that was not what was happening. Behind the scenes, the CIA and British intelligence were running a secret operation to get rid of Mossadegh. They paid people to go out into the streets and start fake riots. They paid newspaper editors to print made-up stories. They bribed politicians to turn against their own government, and it worked. Mossadegh was removed from power. A monarchy that was a lot friendlier to Western oil companies was put in his place. And for decades after, Western officials said they had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. And that story held up until the CIA finally acknowledged what happened in 2013. They also declassified some files which revealed exactly how they planned and pulled off the whole operation known as Operation Ajax. In October 1957, a fire broke out at a nuclear plant called Windscale in the northwest of England. It was a serious disaster. Radioactive material got into the air and drifted across about 200 square miles. People in the surrounding area had no idea any of this was going on, because the government's first move was to get control of the story rather than warn anyone. News reports were heavily restricted, and politicians called it a minor incident. They also blamed the workers at the plant to take the pressure off themselves. The prime minister at the time personally ordered the real investigation report to be locked away. When those internal documents eventually came out years later, the reason was almost embarrassingly straightforward. Britain was in the middle of a nuclear weapons partnership with the United States, and they were just terrified that if the Americans found out how badly they'd botched things, that the whole deal would fall apart. The hidden files weren't released until 1988, more than 30 years after the fact. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service started a medical study in rural Alabama. The people involved were several hundred black sharecroppers, and not one of them was told what the study was actually about. They were told they had something called bad blood. The government was going to take care of them, keep them coming back. The program offered free meals, rides to appointments, yada yada. What was actually happening, these men had syphilis, and the government was watching what the disease does to the human body when left untreated. By the mid-40s, there was a cure. Penicillin was widely available, and it worked. But did they start administering penicillin to the men? No. In fact, they went further than just not curing them. They actively worked to make sure these men couldn't get treatment anywhere else, so the study could keep going. And it kept going all the way until 1972, when someone on the inside leaked the story to the press. By that point, though, many of the men had died. During the Cold War, Western European governments told the citizens that all the military buildup was defensive. The whole point, they said, was to protect against an attack from the outside. In 1990, the Italian prime minister admitted something that most people had never heard of. A secret network of hidden paramilitary units that had been running across Western Europe completely under the radar for decades. It was called Operation Gladio. The original idea was that these hidden groups would act as underground resistance if an enemy army rolled in and tried to take over. And that sounds reasonable on paper. The problem was what investigators found when they actually started going through the records. Parts of this network had gone in a different direction. They'd been working with violent domestic groups to set off explosives in crowded areas like train stations and markets, and then blaming the attacks on left-wing political groups. The whole strategy was obviously to scare people badly enough that they'd vote the other way, opting for a harder, more authoritarian government. On April 26, 1986, a nuclear reactor in Soviet Ukraine exploded in the middle of the night. The Chernobyl disaster. We all know what happened, but at the time, the people living there didn't. At least, they didn't know how severe it really was. Pripyat wasn't evacuated until 24 hours after the explosion. They went about their normal routines for a whole day, breathing heavily contaminated air. And for days, the Soviet government barely said a word about the situation to the press. The people running nearby towns and cities even went ahead with large outdoor events, sending thousands of people outside in air that was filled with radioactive fallout. Calling everything off would have raised too many questions. Things only started to unravel when nuclear monitoring stations in Sweden detected this huge spike in radiation drifting in from the east. Sweden demanded answers, and the Soviet government finally admitted what had happened. By then, though, huge numbers of people had already been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. For years, the U.S. Air Force ran a program called Project Blue Book, which was officially set up to look into reports of strange things people were seeing in the sky. Anytime someone reported something they couldn't explain, the military would come up with some boring explanation. Weather balloon, swamp gas, light bouncing off clouds, stars. Nothing unusual going on, everyone just relax. When the internal files from Project Blue Book were eventually declassified, though, they told a very different story. High-ranking members in the military have been genuinely concerned about these reports for years. For tracking unknown objects on radar. The whole, it was just a weather balloon routine was just that. It was a routine. The thinking was that if they admitted they were seeing things they couldn't identify, it would cause panic and make the military look helpless. So instead, they just kept making up mundane explanations and hoping the public would lose interest. Clearly, that did not happen. I mentioned this a bit earlier, but in 1969, the White House was telling the American public that the war was only going on in Vietnam. Was false. The military had been running a covert operation in Cambodia, hitting supply routes that opposing forces were using to move weapons and troops. They were dropping huge amounts of explosives on rural areas that the public had been told were completely off limits. And to hide this from Congress and the American people, they built a fake record-keeping system. When pilots flew missions over Cambodia, the coordinates were swapped out for fake ones before they took off. Every mission got logged on paper as if it had taken place inside South Vietnam. That wasn't some isolated case. It was thousands of separate flights carried out over more than a year, with records being deliberately altered the entire time. In January 1966, an American military plane carrying 4 nuclear weapons collided with another aircraft over a small fishing village called Palomares in Spain. When 2 of the explosives hit the ground, they detonated on impact. The blast scattered plutonium dust across roughly 2 square kilometers of farmland and neighborhoods. Right away, both the U.S. military and the Spanish government started assuring people that there was nothing to worry about. Behind the scenes, though, the situation was being treated very differently. The military was concerned enough to launch a massive cleanup operation. In the end, more than 5,000 barrels of contaminated soil were dug up and removed from the area. Meanwhile, the people living there barely had any clue how much radioactive material had ended up in the ground around their homes. In 1956, Egypt's leader decided that the Suez Canal, a major shipping route that had been run by outside companies for years, should be under Egyptian control. Not long after, Israel launched a military attack on Egypt. Britain and France sent in their forces to break things up. British Prime Minister went before Parliament and told the country that this was all a surprise, that Britain had rushed in to separate the 2 fighting sides and keep international shipping open, but the whole thing had actually been planned out weeks in advance. A secret document called the Protocol of Sèvres eventually surfaced, and it had signatures from officials representing all 3 countries on it. Turns out, Britain, France, and Israel sat down together in Paris before any of this kicked off, and they came up with the whole thing together. Israel would start the attack, and that would give Britain and France a reason to step in as peacekeepers, take back control of the canal. Well, that has been the video, and I will catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next one.